Hello, welcome back. So it's Thursday, so that means another episode, if you will, of Audiobook Cafe. So tonight, let me actually get the camera on here. There we go. So tonight we're going to be talking about Cappuccino, which I have right here. This is a mint mocha cappuccino that I made. So we'll be talking a little bit about that, and we'll be reading what I like to call How Solo Should Have Happened, Part 1. This is book 1 in a trilogy, because, of course, it is Star Wars, so it has to have a trilogy. There's just a little bit of a glare there, but this is now considered Star Wars... Is it Legends, I think is what they called the... what used to be the expanded universe. The music's a little loud. So, yeah. So, this was before Disney bought Lucasfilm and shattered the timeline, if you will. But this is one of my favorite series in the Star Wars Expanded Universe novels. This tells the story of Han Solo. It's his origin story, if you will. I will preface this by saying I'm a big fan of what Disney has done with the Star Wars franchise for the most part, with a few exceptions. But Solo was a travesty. It was god-awful. If it had been about anybody but Han Solo, so like, let's say instead of the Millennium Falcon, it was some other ship. Instead of Han Solo, it was some other pilot. Take Chewbacca out of the equation there. It might have actually made for a decent Star Wars movie. But yeah, the Han Solo in that movie is very, very hard to reconcile with the Han Solo of the original trilogy, and even the Force Awakens. When you throw these books in here, it becomes even more difficult to reconcile those two versions of Han Solo. But this is a really good book. It's by A.C. Crispin. And so we'll get started on that in just a minute. But first, boy, that music still keeps getting louder and louder. But first, I'm going to have another sip of coffee. Because, oh my god, this is good. And we'll talk about it for a little bit. So as you can see on the screen here, that is the shot of espresso that I pulled. One of the two. And I pulled that for this. So what you see on the screen is currently inside this drink. I wanted to talk, excuse me, I wanted to talk a little bit about how you get that. How you get what's on the screen right here. Right here. So to start with, for good espresso, you want about 7 grams of ground coffee per shot. And a shot is about, depending on how you like it, it can be as little as 1 ounce per shot. Standard usually is about an ounce and a half, all the way up to 2 ounces. There's some fancy Italian words for each type, which I won't bore you with, but basically, to put it into layman's terms, you have your short shot, your regular, and your long shot. This is a standard, so the shot of espresso that you see on your screen is about an ounce and a half. That is generally the way I like it for things like cappuccinos, lattes, and drinks like that. You get a decent mix of caffeine with the flavor of the coffee itself. So that's usually what I'll do for cappuccinos and lattes. If I'm going to drink straight espresso, though, which is definitely an acquired taste, definitely not for everyone, because espresso has a very, very strong flavor. What I will typically do is, I said I wouldn't bore you with Italian words, but it's called a ristretto. It's a short shot, about an ounce. And the reason for that is it gets less caffeine. It draws less of the bitter oils and the bitter caffeine and just gets more of the pure coffee bean flavor into it. And generally when you're when you're making espresso, that's what you're trying to get, is essentially concentrated flavor or essence of the coffee. And that's something that you can see there as well. You can see how it has sort of a head to it, almost like you would get on like a beer or an ale, something like that. That's called the crema. And that essentially has all of the essence of the flavor of the espresso. If you were to take that off, like scoop it off the top, or let it sit until it goes flat, much like you would a stout, for example. If you just cracked open a Guinness and left it on the counter for a while, eventually a lot of that flavor is going to evaporate out, and it's going to taste nasty. So espresso, once it's brewed, has a very, very short shelf life, unless you add it into other things, which is why lattes and mochas, you can take your time and sip it, drink it over the course of an hour or two, and it's perfectly fine. But espresso, you generally want to start drinking it within 30 seconds of it hitting the cup. Maybe within 5 minutes, and you'd be fine. Anyways, so that's what's going on with the picture there. So I pulled 2 standard 1.5 ounce shots for this cappuccino. And the reason this is a cappuccino and not a latte, because a lot of those terms get thrown around. This is a cappuccino because it has more foam on top than a latte does. Without going into too many boring details, and also I should preface this by saying I was a barista for, God, how many years? All through high school, all through college, and I've been making those drinks at home ever since. If you watch many of these Thursday episodes, you'll know pretty quickly that I'm somewhat obsessed with coffee. When I was 16 years old, I didn't ask for a car, asked for an espresso machine, and I got one. My parents were pretty thrilled about the fact that they didn't have to buy me a car. Not that they had to either way. But the fact that I wasn't asking for or expecting a car, I just wanted an espresso machine, which was about $150, $200 at the time, for a decent at-home machine versus, a few thousand for a car. So they were like, yeah, let's get you an espresso machine, no problem. So I got the espresso machine when I was 16, and that kind of started the whole thing. Oh, I have a message. So going back to cappuccino versus latte. So this is a cappuccino because it has more foam on top. Generally, a latte, you're going to have just a very thin layer of foamed milk at the top, or none at all in some cases. Whereas a cappuccino, you can have anywhere from 2/3 of the drink being foam up to about a third. So you'll usually have your standard cappuccino is about half steamed milk, half foamed milk. This one is what would be considered a wet cappuccino, because it is mostly steamed milk, with I'd say about a quarter of the volume being at the top being foamed milk. But yeah, like I said, you can have even more foam than that in a cappuccino, which is called a dry cappuccino. It is pretty much just straight espresso with foamed milk instead of just steamed. It tends to be very strong. But that's actually how I like to test out a coffee place. If I haven't been there before, and it's not, just like a Starbucks or some chain like that, if it's a place that looks like it's actually going to have some pretty artisanal coffee, some really gourmet stuff, I usually like to test it with a dry cappuccino, because I typically don't enjoy straight espresso too often. So that allows me to still get a lot of the flavor of the coffee, to kind of get a sense of how they prepared it and how good the quality is on their beans, without having to drink straight espresso. So anyways, this is a wet cappuccino, because it has less foam than a regular cappuccino, but more than a latte. And then to all of this, I have added about a teaspoon of dark cocoa powder, about a tablespoon of regular white granulated sugar, so your standard table sugar, and then about a teaspoon of creme de menthe liqueur for flavor. It's basically the equivalent of peppermint extract with some sugar added into it. So that's what's in here. So I added all those flavorings first, tossed the espresso in there, stirred that up while I was steaming the milk. Got the milk to about 130, 140 degrees. Tapped the pitcher on the counter a couple times to let the foam and the steamed milk kind of separate. And then poured it in. And that's how we got this. And it is very tasty. And then this was the end result, because it's kind of hard to see on this little camera. You can see here what it looked like right after I got done pouring it. And, oh, here it is. And I did want to show you too, just so you get an idea of just how much coffee goes into a double shot of espresso. This is actually 14 grams of ground espresso ground coffee. So you can see there, that is not a small amount. I'd say it's roughly about 2 to 3 tablespoons if you had to convert it over. But I also wanted to show you so you can kind of see the consistency of it. Let's see. There we go. So you can see this is about like granulated sugar, even a little bit more fine than that. And this is actually a little bit coarse for espresso too. Whenever I ground this, I had the setting a little bit too high, but it was still pretty decent. Um, so, with that, ugh, I hate it when I get cat hair in my mouth. So with that, you take all of that and you put it into something called a portafilter, which is a fancy name for tiny little metal basket on a handle. So you put all that coffee into there, and then you do something called tamping it, which is basically, again, a fancy word for saying press it into the filter. But use a tamper, which looks like this. And the idea is to put, I think it's about 30 psi is what you're looking for. There's a lot of pretty fancy scientific terminology in there and specific measurements. But basically, you just want to put, a decent amount of strength into it when you press it down and twist it. You don't have to push with all your might or all your weight, but you want to make sure that the grounds get evenly compact and sort of flattened in there, and then, of course, brush off any loose stuff off the edges. Because that goes into the espresso machine, gets an airtight seal, and then you put the hot water through there. Now, the reason espresso tastes different than, like, say, drip coffee, so it seems like they should taste pretty similar. I mean, drip coffee, you have hot water that pours over the grounds, and it goes into a pot. Espresso, you have hot water that goes over the grounds, and it goes into a tiny little cup. The difference is pressure. Man, I wish I had a soundboard button for Queens Under Pressure right now. But it's pressure. So it's about 130 psi is ideal. I believe that is 8 bars, I want to say, of atmospheric pressure. Again, tons of fancy technical words, but it basically just means 130 pounds per square inch of force or pressure is going against those finely ground and firmly compacted coffee grounds. And all of that is designed to get just the flavor out of the coffee. So when you do drip coffee, what you end up with is everything that's in the coffee. And coffee beans are one of the most complex organisms, if you will, chemically speaking, on the planet. Like the amount of different chemical compounds and things that are in a coffee bean is insane. But it pulls everything out of there, and a lot of those are really bitter, and that's why drip coffee tends to be very bitter, or even sharp tasting. But with espresso, you have all that pressure, and so it's kind of like if you imagine roasting a chicken. If you roast a chicken in an oven versus cooking a chicken in a pressure cooker. So in a pressure cooker, the chicken gets done a lot faster, and it also retains more of the flavor, more of the juices stay in because of the cooking method. So espresso's pretty similar. That pressure just pulls all the flavor out. Now, the interesting thing with that is a lot of people think espresso has more caffeine than regular coffee, but that's actually false. It just tastes stronger because it's essentially coffee flavor concentrate. So because it tastes stronger, it tastes, it's not even more bitter because it's actually quite smooth. It just tastes more intense. So people tend to think, oh, espresso's got more caffeine in it, I need espresso to wake up. But it actually won't do that for you. If you did a long shot of espresso, you might get closer to the amount of caffeine that's in a regular cup of coffee, because you're pulling 2 ounces of water through the grounds instead of just 1 to 1.5. But still, if your main goal is caffeine content, then you're going to want to go with just drip coffee. Anyway, so once you get done pulling the shot of espresso, when you pull the portafilter out, it should look something like this. And you can see on here that the grounds are pretty evenly distributed in here. It kind of looks like pressed asphalt. And again, the grind on this was actually a bit more coarse than I would have normally gone with. So apparently when I ground this coffee, I didn't pay close enough attention to the grinder setting. But this is still okay. So if you don't have like a conical burr grinder or something like that, you just have, say, a blade grinder or like a spice grinder, but you still want to try for espresso, this is okay. I mean, this is not going to produce horrible espresso. I mean, as you saw, this looks pretty decent for a home machine, and I've been drinking this and it tastes delicious. So I may not want to pull a shot of espresso to drink straight from this, but for a latte or cappuccino, perfectly fine. But the main thing that you want to see here, like I said, is that it looks kind of like asphalt. So it's evenly compacted. There's no holes in it. It's not sludgy or muddy looking. And that denotes that all of the water has gone through the grounds pretty uniformly, pretty evenly. And that's what you want. So that's about all I will bore you with tonight about coffee. But if you do have more questions about the differences between cappuccinos and lattes and mochas and all that jazz, or recipe tips, he said I was a pro barista for about 8 years, roughly. Worked in a lot of different coffee shops, helped manage some, trained a lot of baristas, and it's one thing that I do have a lot of passion for. I love to cook in general, but beverages, so cocktails, virgin cocktails, smoothies, things like that, and especially coffees and teas are something that I love to make. So if you have questions, feel free to DM me. You can message me on Twitch. You can message me on Twitter. I'll go ahead and throw that up here. And you can also message on Discord. If I can remember my command for that.
Do it.
There we go. Oops, that actually posted twice. But anyways, there's the Discord, so you can join our Discord server. You can message me there with questions that you have. Or if you don't have specific questions, you just want to learn more, keep tuning in every Thursday, because every Thursday we're going to do this audiobook cafe, where I'll do a different type of coffee each week, different origin coffee, different brand, or different preparation style, and we'll talk about it. Usually about the first 15 to 30 minutes of every Thursday's episode is about the coffee before we jump into the book itself. So, my Discord is blowing up. Let me check that real quick. Excuse me. Okay. Checking Twitter. Oh, that was just somebody liking the tweet about the book. Okay. Fantastic. Well, we'll go ahead and get rid of that. Show the guild hall again. And let's jump into the book. After I drink some more coffee, because it's seriously absolutely delicious. Highly recommend this recipe. All right. All right, Star Wars: The Paradise Snare. Move the microphone a little bit closer since I'm leaning back. By A.C. Crispin. This was written in 1997. This book is dedicated to my friend Thea Rose. When we were 12, we swore we'd always be best friends, and more years later than we like to count, we still are. That's the dedication for the book. Acknowledgements, we can skip that. Alright, Chapter 1, Trader's Luck. The ancient troop ship, a relic of the Clone Wars, hung in orbit over the planet Corellia, silent and seemingly derelict. Looks were deceiving, however. The old Liberator-class vessel, once called Guardian of the Republic, now had a new life as Trader's Luck. The interior had been gutted and refitted with a motley assortment of living environments, and now contained nearly 100 sentient beings, many of them humanoid. At the moment, however, only a few of them were awake, since it was the middle of the sleep cycle. There was a watch on the bridge, of course. Trader's Luck spent much of its time in orbit, but it was still capable of hyperspace travel, even though it was slow by modern standards. Garrus Shrike, the leader of the loosely allied trading clan that lived aboard the Luck, was a strict taskmaster who followed formal ship's protocols, so there was always a watch on the bridge. Shrike's orders aboard the Luck were always obeyed. He was not a man to cross without a good reason and a fully charged blaster. He ruled the clan of traders as a less than benevolent despot. A slender man of medium height, Garrus was handsome in a hard-edged way. Streaks of silver white above his temples accentuated his black hair and ice-blue eyes. His mouth was thin-lipped, he seldom smiled, and never with good humor. Garrus Shrike was an expert shot and had spent his early years as a professional bounty hunter. He'd given it up, though, due to bad luck, meaning that his lack of patience had caused him to lose the richest bounties reserved for live delivery. Dead bodies were frequently worth far less. Shrike did possess a warped sense of humor, especially if the pain of others was involved. Excuse me. When he was gambling and winning, he was subject to bouts of manic gaiety, and especially if he was also drunk, as he was at the moment. Sitting around the table in the former wardroom of enlisted officers, Shrike was playing sabacc and drinking tankards of potent Alderaanian ale, his favorite beverage. Shrike peered at his card chips, mentally calculating. Should he hold pat and hope to complete a pure sabacc? At any moment, the dealer could push a button and the values of all the card chips would shift. If that happened, he'd be busted, unless he took an additional 2 and tossed most of his hand into the interference field in the center of the table. One of his fellow players, a hulking Eloman, I think? Or Eloman? Suddenly turned his tusked head to glance behind him. A light on one of the auxiliary status panels was blinking. The huge, shaggy-furred Eloman grunted, then said in guttural basic, "Something funny about the lockout sensor on the weapons cache, Captain." Shrike insisted on proper protocol and chain of command, especially as it applied to himself. Unless engaged in some planet-side caper, he always wore a military uniform while aboard the Luck, one he designed himself. Pattern on the dress uniform of a high-ranking Moff. It was hung about with medals and decorations. Shrike had picked up in pawn shops across the galaxy. Now, hearing the Element's warning, he glanced up a little blearily, rubbed his eyes, then straightened up and dropped his card chips onto the table. What is it, Brafid? The giant being wrinkled his tough snout. Not sure, Captain. It's reading normal now, but something flickered, as though the lock shorted out for a second. Probably just a momentary power flux. Moving with such unusual grace and coordination that even the foppish uniform couldn't detract from his presence, the captain rose and walked around the table to study the readouts himself. All signs of intoxication had vanished. Not a power flux, he decided after a moment. Something else. Turning his head, he addressed the tall, heavy-set human on his left. Laird, look at this. Somebody shorted out the lock and is running a sim to fool us into thinking it's just a power flux. We've got a thief aboard. Is everyone armed? The man addressed, who happened to be Shrike's brother, Laird Shrike, nodded, patting the holster that hung on the outside of his thigh. Brafid the Eleman fingered his tingler, an electric prod that was his weapon of choice, though the hairy alien was large enough to pick up most humanoids and break them over his knee. The other person present, a female Celestin who was the Lux Navigator, stood up, patting the scaled-down blaster she wore. "Ready for action, Captain," she squeaked. Despite her diminutive height, flapping jowls, and large, appealing bright eyes, Noonie Dalvo appeared almost as dangerous as the hulking Elemen, who was her closest shipboard friend. "Good," Shrike grunted. "Noonie, go post a guard over the weapons locker, just in case he comes back. Lared, activate the biosensors. See if you can ID the thief and where he's heading." Shrike's brother nodded and bent over the auxiliary control board. "Corellian human," he announced after a moment. "Male, young, height 1.8 meters. Dark hair and eyes, slender build. The bioscanner says it recognizes him. He's heading aft toward the galley." Strike's expression hardened until his eyes were as cold and blue as the glaciers on Hoth. "The Solo kid," he said. "He's the only one cocky enough to try something like this." He flexed his fingers, then hardened them into a fist. The ring he wore, made from a single gem of Deveronian blood poison, flashed dull silver in the bulkhead lights. "Well, I've gone easy on him so far, because he's a good swoop pilot, and I never lost when I bet on him. But enough is enough. Tonight I'm going to teach him to respect authority, and he's going to wish he'd never been born." Shrike's teeth flashed, much brighter than the gem in his ring. "Or that I'd never found him 17 years ago and brought his sniveling, pants-wetting little behind home to the luck. I'm a patient, tolerant man," he sighed theatrically. "As the galaxy knows, but even I have my limits." He glanced over at his brother, who was looking rather uncomfortable. Garrus wondered if Lared was remembering the Solo Kid's last punishment session a year ago. The youth hadn't been able to walk for 2 days. Shrike's mouth tightened. He wouldn't tolerate any softness among his subordinates. "Right, Lared?" he said too softly. Right, Captain." Han Solo gripped the stolen blaster as he tiptoed along the narrow metal corridor. When he'd wired into the sim and jimmied the lock into the weapons cache, he'd only had a moment to reach in and grab the first weapon that came to hand. There'd been no time to pick and choose. Nervously, he pushed the strands of damp, browned hair back from his forehead, realizing he was sweating. The blaster felt heavy and awkward in his hand as he examined it. Han had seldom held one before, and he only knew how to check the charge from the reading he'd done. He'd never actually fired a weapon. Garrus Shrike didn't permit anyone but his officers to walk around armed. Squinting in the dim light, the young swoop pilot flipped open a small panel in the thickest part of the barrel and peered down at the readouts. Good, fully charged. Shrike may be a bully and a fool, but he runs a taut ship. Not even to himself would the youth admit how much he actually feared and hated the captain of Trader's Luck. He'd learned long ago that showing fear of any sort was a swift guarantee of a beating, or worse. The only thing bullies and fools respected was courage, or at least bravado. So Han Solo had learned never to allow fear to surface in his mind or heart. There were times when he was dimly aware that it was there, deep down, buried under layers of street toughness, but any time he recognized it for what it was, Han resolutely buried it even deeper. Experimentally, he swung the blaster up to eye level and awkwardly closed one brown eye as he sighted along the barrel. The muzzle of the weapon wavered slightly, and Han cursed softly under his breath as he realized his hand was trembling. "Come on," he told himself. "Show some backbone, Solo. Getting off the ship and away from Shrike, it's worth a little risk." Reflexively, he glanced over his shoulder, then turned back just in time to duck under a low-hanging power coupling. He'd chosen this route because it avoided all the living quarters and recreation areas, but it was so narrow and low-ceilinged that he was beginning to feel claustrophobic as he tiptoed forward, resisting the urge to turn and look back over his shoulder. Ahead of him, the near tunnel widened out, and Han realized he was almost at his destination. Only a few more minutes, he told himself, continuing to move with a stealthy grace that made his progress as soundless as that of a walnut-spurred towpads. He was skirting the hyperdrive modules now, and then a larger corridor intersected. Han turned right, relieved that he could now walk without stooping. He crept up to the door of the big galley and hesitated outside, his ears and nose busy. Sounds... Yes, only the ones he'd been expecting to hear. The soft clatter of metal pans, the splooch of dough being punched, and then the faint sounds of it being kneaded. Excuse me. He could smell the dough now, wastrel bread, his favorite. Han's mouth tightened. With any luck, he wouldn't be here to eat any of this particular batch. Sticking the blaster into his belt, he opened the door and stepped into the galley. "Hey, Dulana," he said softly. "It's me. I've come to say goodbye." The tall, furred being who had been vigorously kneading the wastrel dough swung around to face him with a soft, inquiring growl. Dulana's real name was... I'm going to try not to butcher this. Dulana Mapia? Dulana Mapia, maybe? And she had been Han's closest friend since she'd come to live aboard Trader's Luck nearly 10 years ago, when Han had been about 9. The young swoop pilot had no idea of when he'd been born, of course, or who his parents had been. If it hadn't been for Dulana, he wouldn't even have known that his last name was Solo. Han couldn't speak Wookiee. Trying to reproduce the growls, barks, roars, and rumbling grunts made his throat sore, and he knew he sounded ridiculous. But he understood it very well. For her part, Dulana couldn't speak Basic, but she understood it as well as she did her own language, so communication between the human youth and the elderly Wookiee widow was fluent. Just different. Han had gotten used to it years ago and never thought about it anymore. He and Dulana just talked. They understood each other perfectly. Now he hefted the stolen blaster, careful not to point it at his friend. "Yes," he replied, in response to Dulana's comment. "Tonight's the night. I'm getting off the Trader's Luck, and I'm never coming back." Dulana rumbled at him worriedly as she automatically resumed kneading her dough. Han shook his head, giving her a lopsided grin. "You worry too much, Dulana. Of course, I've got it all planned. I've got a spacesuit stashed in a locker near the robot freighter docks, and there's a ship dock there now that'll be departing as soon as it's unloaded and refueled. Robot freighter, and it's headed where I want to go." Dulana punched her dough, then growled a soft interrogatory. "I'm headed for Alesia," Han told her. "Remember I told you all about it? It's a religious colony near Hut Space, and they offer pilgrim sanctuary from the outside universe. I'll be safe from Shrike there. And..." He held up a small holodisc where the Wookiee cook could see it. "Look at this. They're advertising for a pilot. I already used up the last of my payout credits from the job we pulled to send a message, telling them I'm coming to interview for the job." Dulana roared softly. "Hey, I can't let you do that," Han protested, watching the cook set the loaves into pans and slide them into the thermal grid to bake. "I'll be okay. I'll lift some credits on my way to the robot ship. Don't worry, Dulana." The Wookiee ignored him as she shuffled quickly across the galley, her hairy, slightly stooped form moving rapidly despite her advanced age. Dulana was nearly 600 years old, Han knew. Old even for a Wookiee. She disappeared into the door of her private living quarters, and then, a moment later, reappeared clutching a pouch woven of some silky material that might even, from the look of it, be Wookiee fur. She held it out to him with a soft, insistent whine. Han shook his head again and childlessly put his hands behind his back. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not taking your savings, Dulana. You'll need those credits to buy passage to join me." The Wookiee cocked her head and made a short questioning sound. "Of course you're going to join me," Han said. "You don't think I'm going to leave you here to rot on this hulk, do you? Shrike gets crazier every year. Nobody's safe aboard the Luck. When I get to Alesia and get settled in, I'm going to send for you to join me. Alesia is a religious retreat, and they offer their pilgrim sanctuary. Shrike won't be able to touch us there." Dulana reached inside the pouch, her hairy fingers surprisingly dexterous, as she sifted through the credit vouchers inside. She handed several to her young friend. With a sigh, Han relented and took them. "Well, okay, but this is just a loan, okay? I'm going to pay you back the salary the Ilsian priests are offering is a good one." She growled her assent, then, without warning, reached out to ruffle his hair with her massive paw, leaving it sticking out in a wild disarray. "Hey!" Han yelped. Wookiee head rubs were not to be taken lightly. "I just combed my hair." Dulana growled, amused, and Han drew himself up indignantly. "I do not look better, Scruffy. I keep telling you the term Scruffy ain't complimentary among humans." He stared at her, his indignation vanishing as he realized that this was the last time he'd see her beloved furry face, her gentle blue eyes, for a long time. Dulana had been his closest and frequently only friend for so long now. Leaving her was hard, very hard. Impulsively, the Corellian youth threw himself against her warm, solid bulk, hugging her fiercely. His head reached only to the middle of her chest. Han could remember when he barely stood as tall as her waist. "I'm gonna miss you," he said, his face muffled against her fur, his eyes stinging. "You take care of yourself, Dulana." She roared softly, and her long, hairy arms came around him as she returned the embrace. "Well, ain't this a touching sight?" said a cold, all too familiar voice. Han and Dulana both froze, then wheeled to face the man who'd entered through the Wookiee's quarters. Garrus Shrike lounged in the doorway, his handsome features set in a smile that made Han's blood coagulate in his veins. Beside him, he could feel Dulana shudder, either with fear or loathing. Two other crew members, Laird Shrike and Brafid, the Element, were visible over Shrike's shoulder. Han balled his fist with frustration. If it had only been Shrike, he might have chanced jumping the Lux captain. With Dulana to help him, they might have been able to subdue Garrus, but with Lard and the Element present, they didn't have a chance. Han was acutely conscious of the stolen blaster shoved into his belt. For a moment, he considered going for it, but he abandoned that idea. Shrike was known for being fast on the draw. There was no way he could beat him, and that might get both Dulana and himself killed. Shrike was clearly in a rage. Han licked dry lips. "Listen, Captain," he began. "I can explain." Shrike drew himself up, his eyes narrowing. "You can explain what, you cowardly little traitor? Stealing from your family? Betraying those who trusted you? Stabbing your benefactor in the back, you sniveling little thief? But I've had it with you, Solo. I've been lenient with you so far because you're a blasted good swoop pilot, and all that prize money came in handy. But my patience has ended." Shrike ceremoniously pushed up the sleeves of his bedizened uniform? Not actually familiar with that word. Then balled his hands into fists. The galley's artificial lighting made the blood jewel ring glitter dull silver. "Let's see what a few days of fighting off Deveronian blood poisoning does for your attitude, along with maybe a few broken bones. I'm doing this for your own good, boy. Someday you'll thank me." Han gulped with terror as Shrike started toward him. He'd lashed out at the traitor captain once before, 2 years ago, when he'd been feeling cocky after winning the gladiatorial free-for-all on Jubilar, and had been instantly sorry. The speed and strength of Garrus' returning blow had snapped his head back and split both lips so thoroughly that Dulana had to feed him mush for a week until they healed. With a snarl, Dulana stepped forward. Shrike's hand dropped to his blaster. "You stay out of this, old Wookiee," he snapped in a voice nearly as harsh as Dulana's. "Your cooking isn't that good." Han had already grabbed his friend's furry arm and was forcibly holding her back. "Dulana, no." She shook off his hold as easily as she would have waved off an annoying insect, and roared at Shrike. The captain drew his blaster, and chaos erupted. "No!" Han screamed, and leaped forward, his foot lashing out in an old street fighting technique. His instep impacted solidly with Shrike's breastbone. The captain's breath went out in a great hoof, and he went over backward. Han hit the deck and rolled. A singular bolt sizzled past his ear. "Laird!" wheezed the captain as Dulana started towards him. Shrike's brother drew his blaster and pointed it at the Wookiee. "Stop, Dulana!" His words had no more effect than Han's. Dulana's blood was up. She was in full Wookiee battle rage. With a roar that deafened the combatants, she grabbed Laird's wrist and yanked, spinning him around and snapping him in a terrible parody of a child's snap-the-whip game. Han heard a crunch mixed with several pops as tendons and ligaments gave way. Laird Shrike shrieked, a high, shrill noise that carried such pain that the Corellian youth's arm ached in sympathy. Grabbing the blaster from his belt, Han snapped off a shot at the Element, who was leaping forward, Tingler ready and aimed at Dulana's midsection. Brafid howled, dropping his weapon. Han was amazed that he'd managed to hit him, but he didn't have long to wonder about the accuracy of his aim. Shrike was staggering to his feet, blaster in hand, aimed squarely at Han's head. "Laird!" he yelled at the writhing heap of agony that was his brother. Lara did not reply. Shrike cocked the blaster and stepped even closer to Han. "Stop it, Dulana," the captain snarled at the Wookiee, "or your buddy Solo dies." Han dropped his blaster and put his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Dulana stopped in her tracks, growling softly. Shrike leveled the blaster and his finger tightened on the trigger. Pure malevolent hatred was etched upon his features. And then he smiled, pale blue eyes glittering with ruthless joy. "For insubordination and striking your captain," he announced, "I sentence you to death, Solo. May you rot in all the hells there ever were." As Han froze, expecting the bolt to fry him any moment, Dulana roared, shoved Han aside, and leapt for Shrike. The blaster's energy beam caught her full in the chest, and she went down in a heap of charred fur and burned flesh. "Dulana!" Han yelled in anguish. With a quickness he hadn't known he possessed, he dived at Shrike, hitting the captain at a diving tackle around his knees. Shrike went over backward again, and this time his head impacted solidly with the deck. He sagged, out cold. Han crawled back to his friend, turning her over gently, seeing the great hole the blaster beam had bored into her chest. He knew immediately that the wound was mortal. No medical droid ever constructed could heal this. Dulana moaned, gasped, and fought with all her great Wookiee strength to breathe. Han slid his arms beneath her shoulders and tried to ease her struggle. Her blue eyes opened, and after a moment fixed on his. Lucidity returned, and she rumbled softly. "No, I won't leave you," Han replied, clutching harder. Tears blurred his vision, and she swam below him in a sea of brown fur. "I don't care if I get away." Tulana. Making a great effort, she raised a huge furred paw hand and grasped his arm. Han had to struggle to translate her speech. "I know," he choked, talking aloud so she'd know he understood her. "I know you care about me." She rumbled again, "as much as you do your own children." Han swallowed, his throat tight and aching. I feel the same way, Dulana. You're the closest thing to a mother I'll ever have." A long moan of anguish made her shudder. She rumbled at him again. "No," Han insisted. "I'm not leaving you. I'll stay with you till... He couldn't finish the sentence. Dulana grabbed his arm with a ghost of her old strength and growled at him urgently. Han was having trouble comprehending her slurred speech. "If I die... nothing? Oh, you're saying that if I don't live, you'll have died for nothing?" She nodded, her eyes and their nest of hair holding his with all the intensity she could muster. Han shook his head stubbornly. How could he abandon her to die alone? Dulana rumbled softly, faintly. "Yeah, I'm sure you'll be safe, one with the life power," Han said, trying to sound sincere. He knew some Wookiees believed in a unifying power that bound all of his existence together. Personally, he thought this power... He'd never been able to translate the term accurately. The Wookiee word could have meant strength or force, too. But the force, the power that Dulana believed in so steadfastly was just superstition. But if it comforted her to believe in it during her dying moments, Han wasn't going to argue with her. He remembered the words she'd said to him several times. "Dulana, may the life power be with you." For a moment he wished that he too could believe. She moaned with pain. Han could see she was going fast. Then Dulana rumbled feebly, and again he automatically translated. "Your last request," he choked, barely able to get the words out. "You want me to go, to live, and to be happy." Han struggled not to break down. "Okay," he agreed. "I'll go. I still have time to get aboard that robot ship before it takes off." Dulana whined faintly. "I promise," he agreed, his voice ragged. "I'll go now, and I swear I'll always remember you, Dulana." She was beyond speech now, but he was sure she'd heard him. He laid her gently on the deck, then rose and picked up the blaster. Then, after giving Dulana one final look, Han turned and raced out the door. Okay. His running feet resounded through the corridors of Trader's Luck. The time was past for stealth. He had to reach the docking bay and that robot Elysian freighter. Han had no idea when it was due to blast away from the Luck, but the loading schedule posted for the space dock workers had listed as being ready for blast-off as soon as the droids finished fueling. And when he'd swiped the spacesuit and hidden it, they'd just started that process. Excuse me. The Elysian dream might be leaving any moment. Gasping, Han sprinted for the lock, his feet thudding along the decks that had been his playground ever since he was old enough to remember. In the distance, he could hear sleepy voices interspersed with shouts and orders. I can't let them catch me. Shrike will kill me. The certainty lent speed to his flying feet. He skidded around the final turn and grabbed the spacesuit he'd hidden behind some fueling equipment. The helmet flopped over his arm, banging him in the midsection as he hastily keyed in the code he'd stolen into the airlock door. Seconds passed. The sounds of pursuit were growing louder, but surely they'd think he was headed for the shuttle deck or even the life pods. Nobody would guess he'd be crazy enough to try stowing away on a robot freighter. At least that's what he was counting on. The lock hissed open. Han leapt inside, closed the hatch, and began yanking on the spacesuit. He checked the air storage. Full. Good. He had originally planned to bring along some extra air packs, but he didn't dare venture back out. The pack on the suit was good for 2 days. That should be enough, unless the Dream was a really slow vessel. Since it was a robot drone, he had no way of discovering what course it would be following, or how fast it was scheduled to go. Han grimaced. Only a desperate man would use this method of escape. He was desperate, all right. He just hoped he wouldn't arrive on Elysia dead because he'd run out of air. Let's see. Food pellets, full. Water tank, full. Good. That was Captain Shrike again, insisting that all ship's equipment be maintained in perfect working order. Han dragged the suit up over the arms of the ship's gray jumpsuit, or dragged the suit up over the arms of his ship's gray jumpsuit, and closed the seam running up the front. He picked up the helmet, clumsily because of the gloves, and settled it over his head. It was mostly glassine, and he could see every direction except directly behind him. A bank of hollows ran around the bottom rim of the helmet, giving him his vitals, amount of air remaining, and all other information he needed to survive. Han could talk to his suit in a limited fashion by bumping his chin against the communications lever and giving the suit instructions concerning his temperature, air mix, and so forth. Okay, this is it, the young man thought as he clumped over to the connecting hatch and keyed in the final sequence to equalize pressure between the lock and the Elysian Dream. He could faintly hear a hiss as the air was pumped out of the lock. The Dream, being a robot, didn't need air to operate. The ship would be filled only with a vacuum. Finally, the hatch opened and Han stepped inside. It was crowded with equipment and cargo, and the corridors were very narrow. The Dream wasn't constructed to accommodate a living crew, only for routine maintenance, and Han had to turn sideways to squeeze in. The youth was fleetingly grateful that all standard engineering was designed to function in gravity. Otherwise, he might have had to contend with 0G, and that would have been a real pain. He'd been outside the trader's luck with the welding crew in spacesuits several times since he'd been considered old enough for hazardous ship's duty. Hanging in space, tethered to the ship only by a seemingly fragile umbilical. It had been kind of exciting the first couple times, but Han didn't particularly care for weightlessness, and he'd soon learned never to look down. Seeing nothing but space beneath his feet for light years and light years was enough to make his head swim. Han clumped toward the bridge, figuring that was where the maximum amount of room would be. He reached it in only moments. The Dream was a small ship. If her cargo list was correct, she'd brought in a shipment of top-grade glitterstem spice and would be leaving with a cargo of high-quality Corellian electronic components that could be used in factory maintenance. Han wondered for a moment whom Garishreich had paid off to be able to receive a shipment of spice. The substance was rigidly controlled by most planetary governments and also by the Imperial Trade Commission. He turned sideways to enter the bridge and froze. What in the name of all the sons of Barab is an astromech droid doing on the bridge? Everyone knew a droid couldn't pilot a ship by itself, so it couldn't be piloting. Han grimaced behind the glassine helmet. This droid must be there as a sort of burglar alarm, a sophisticated communications device to help deter portside thieves or space pirates. Han knew that one of the reasons the Elysian priests were eager to hire a pilot, preferably a Corellian, their ad had read, was that they'd been been losing robot ships to piracy. As he froze, hoping the droid wasn't aware of his presence, the young man felt the dream shudder. We're undocking. I've got to get braced for breakaway thrust. Quickly he edged away from the bridge and headed back towards the cargo area. Finally, he found what he was looking for, and just in time. A small space that he could sit down in, just the right size to allow him to brace himself with his arms and legs. The dream shuddered again, and then again. Mentally, Han pictured the docking clamps falling away one by one. One more to go, then... The ship shuddered one more time, then lurched violently. Since the dream wasn't supposed to be manned, it could utilize acceleration patterns that were much rougher than those used in a vessel with a living crew. Wham! Han's body jerked, then he braced himself against the thrust of the violent acceleration. The dream was undocked and away. Mentally, Han pictured them thrusting away from Trader's Luck out of the embrace of Corellia's gravity field. Closing his eyes, he pictured his home world, turning lazily against the backdrop of stars. Corellia was a pretty planet, with narrow blue seas, green-brown forests, tan deserts, and large cities. On the night side, it glittered like a battle remote studded with lights. The hardest thrust of acceleration hit then, and Han was pinned uncomfortably against the cargo container. We've made the jump to light speed, he realized. Moments later, as the ship's speed evened out, he was able to move again. He flexed his arms and legs, wincing as bruises made themselves felt. From the fight in the galley, he realized. The thought made him remember Dulana with a sudden, visceral sadness. Tears stung his eyes, and he fought them back fiercely. Crying in a spacesuit helmet was a lousy idea, since you couldn't wipe your face. Han sniffed, trying to blink back the tears. Dulana, he thought. His friend had given her life to give him this chance. Get a hold of yourself, Solo, he ordered himself sternly. His throat ached, but Han gulped, swallowed hard, then bit his lip until the urge to cry receded. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried, and what was the point? It wouldn't bring Dulana back. Han knew Dulana believed in an afterlife of the spirit. If she was right about that, then maybe she could hear him now. Hey, Dulana, Han whispered. I made it. I'm on my way. I'm going to Alesia, and I'm going to become the best pilot in the sector. I'll learn enough and earn enough to apply for the academy. The way we always dreamed. I'm free, Dulana. His voice broke. We're safe, Dulana. Shrike can't touch either of us now. Wedged into his little crevice, the young pilot smiled with grim determination. I am free, and I owe it all to you. I'll never forget it, either. If I ever get a chance to pay you back by helping one of your people, I swear to anything that's out there, any god or life power or force, I won't hesitate. Han Solo took a long, deep breath of canned spacesuit air. Thank you, Dulana, he whispered. Wherever she was now, he'd hoped she could hear him. Chapter 2, Alessian Dreams. So, how are we feeling about the book so far? If anyone is actively in the channel, lurking is okay too. Excuse me. Alright, I'm going to take that as everybody's enjoying it. When Han awoke from exhausted sleep, he was completely disoriented at first. Where am I? He wondered groggily. Memory came rushing back in swift, violent images. His own hand holding a blaster, Shrike's face twisted with hatred and rage, Dulana gasping, dying alone. He swallowed hard, his throat aching. Dulana had been a part of his life since he was just a little kid. 8, perhaps, or 9. He remembered the day she'd come aboard with her mate, Ishadik. Ishadik had been outlawed from the Wookiee homeworld for some crime that Dulana had never referred to. She'd followed her mate into exile, leaving behind all that she'd ever known, her home and their grown cubs. A year or so later, Ishadik had been killed during a smuggling run to Nar Heka, one of the worlds in the Hutt sector. Shrike had announced to Dulana that she could remain aboard Trader's Luck as a cook, since he'd grown to like the foods she'd prepared. Dulana could have gone back to Kashyyyk. After all, she'd committed no crimes, but she chose to stay aboard the Luck. Because of me, Han thought, as he located the water dispenser inside his helmet and took a cautious sip. Then he tongued up a couple of food pellets and washed them down with another swallow. It wasn't the same as food, but they'd kept him going for the day. She stayed because of me. She wanted to protect me from Shrike. He sighed, knowing it to be true. Wookiees were among the most steadfast and loyal companions in the galaxy, or so he'd heard. Wookiee loyalty and friendship was not lightly given, but once bestowed, it never wavered. He leaned back in his alcove, checking the air pack. 3/4 left. Han wondered how far the dream had traveled while he'd slept. In a little while, he'd go to the control room, see if he could decipher the instrumentation on the autopilot. Han's mind drifted back in time, remembering Dulana sadly. Then as he relaxed, his mind wandered to even earlier days. His earliest real memory. Everything else was just meaningless fragments, snatches of images too old and distorted to have any meaning. He thought of the day Garrus Shrike had brought him home to the Trader's Luck. The child huddled in the mouth of the dank, filthy alley, trying not to cry. He was too big to cry, wasn't he? Even if he was cold and hungry and alone. For a moment the child wondered why he was alone. But it was as if a huge metal door slammed down on that thought, shutting everything behind it. Behind the door lay danger. Behind that door lay bad things. Pain and... The boy shook his head, and his lank, filthy hair fell straggling into his face. He pushed it back with a hand that was so grimed with dirt that his natural skin color barely showed. He wore only a pair of ragged pants and a torn, sleeveless tunic that was too small. His feet were bare. Had he ever had shoes? The child thought that perhaps he remembered shoes. Good shoes. Nice ones. Shoes that someone had put on his feet and helped him fasten. Someone who was gentle, who smiled instead of scowled. Someone who was clean and smelled good, who wore pretty clothes. Slam. The door came down again, and little Han, he knew that was his name, but knew of no other that went with it, winced from the pain in his mind. He knew better than to let those thoughts fill his mind. Thoughts and memories like that were bad. They hurt. Better not to think them. He sniffled again and wiped futilely at his running nose. He realized he was standing in a puddle of foulness, and that his feet were so cold he could barely feel them. It was night now, and it promised to be a cold one. Hunger twisted in Han's stomach like a living thing, a creature that bit painfully. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. Had it been this morning when he'd found that kavasa fruit in a garbage dump? The ripe, juicy one that was only half eaten? Or had that been last night? He couldn't keep standing here, the little boy decided. He had to move. Han stepped out of the alley onto the pathwalk. Excuse me. He knew how to beg. Who was it that had taught him? Slam. Never mind who taught him. They had taught him well, adjusting his features to their most pitiful. Han shuffled towards the nearest passerby. "Please, lady," he whimpered. "Hungry. I'm so hungry." He held out his hand, palm up. The woman he addressed slowed fractionally, then suddenly looked down at his dirty palm and recoiled, holding her skirts back so they wouldn't brush against him. "Lady," Han breathed, turning with more than professional interest to watch her walk away. She had on a nice dress, soft and shiny, sort of glowing in the harsh streetlights of the Corellian harbor town. She reminded him of someone, with her big dark eyes, her smooth skin, her hair. Slam. He began to sob hopelessly, his small body shaking from cold, hunger, grief, and loneliness. "Hey there, Han." The sharp but not unfriendly voice broke through his wall of misery. Sniffling and gulping, Han looked up to see a tall form bending over him. Black hair, pale blue eyes. He smelled of Alderaanian ale and the smoke from half a dozen prescribed drugs. But he was steady on his feet, unlike many of the other passers-by. Seeing that Han was looking up at him, the man squatted down onto his heels, which brought him to only a little above Han's eye level. "You're too big to cry in the street. You know that, don't you?" Han nodded, still sniffling, but trying to control himself. Yes. At first he lisped a little, the way he had when he'd first learned to talk. That was a long, long time ago, Han thought. He'd been talking since the cold season, and it was soon going to be cold season again. He'd been talking since Slam. The child shuddered again as his mind resolutely shut away all his memories of that before time. Something else surfaced, something he'd overlooked at first in his misery. Han's eyes widened. This man had called him by name. How does he know my name? You, who are you? Han whispered. How do you know my name? The man grinned, showing many teeth. It was meant to be a friendly expression, Han could tell, but there was something about it that made him shudder. It reminded him of the packs of canoids that hunted prey in the alleys. I know lots of things, kid, the man replied. Call me Captain Shrike. Can you say that? Yes, Captain Shrike, Han parroted uncertainly. He hiccuped at his sobbing, or as his sobbing died away. But how did you know my name, please? The man put out a hand as if to ruffle his hair, then seemed to take in the dirt and scritchies inhabiting his young scalp, and thought better of it. You'd be surprised, Han. I know almost everything that goes on here on Corellia. I know who's lost and who's found, who's for sale and who's sold, and where all the bodies are buried. Matter of fact, I've had my eye on you. You seem like a smart lad. Are you smart? Han drew himself up, eyed the man levelly. Yes, Captain, he said, forcing his voice to be steady. I'm smart. Han knew he was, too. Anyone who wasn't didn't last for months on the streets the way he had. Good, that's the lad. Well, I could use a smart lad to work for me. Why don't you come with me? I'll give you a square meal and a warm place to sleep. He grinned again. And I just bet you'd like to see my ship. He pointed up to the darkening sky. Han nodded eagerly. Food, a bed, and especially... A spaceship? Yes, Captain, I want to be a pilot when I grow up. The man laughed and held out his hand. Well, come on then. Han let the big hand engulf his, and the two of them walked away together, toward the spaceport. Han stirred and shook his head. And I should never have gone with him that day, he thought. If I hadn't gone with him, Julana would still be alive. But if he hadn't gone with Shrike, he probably would have awakened some night in the alley to find that Vreltz had chewed his ears and nose off, the way they had one of the other alley urchins that Gareth Shrike had quote-unquote rescued. Han smiled grimly. Captain Shrike didn't have an altruistic bone in his body. He collected children and used them to turn a profit. Almost every planet the Luck visited, Shrike loaded up a group of his rescuees and took them down to the streets in their shuttle. Then he left them under the supervision of a droid he programmed himself, F8GN. 8GN assigned them to their territories and kept track of their proceeds as the children roamed the streets begging and pickpocketing. They'd use the littlest ones, the skinniest ones, the deformed ones for begging. The Vrelt-Nod girl, Denalis, had always done well. Shrike kept her working hard for years by promising her that when she'd earned enough for him, he'd get her face fixed for her, so she'd look human again. But he never had. When she was about 14, Denalis evidently realized that Shrike was never going to make good on his promises. One night she went into the Lux airlock and cycled it, without first putting on a suit. Han had been on the cleanup crew. He shuddered at the memory. Poor Denalis. He could still picture her in his mind, handing over a day's begging receipts to 8GN. The droid was tall and spindly, made from coppery reddish metal. It had been repaired so many times that it had patches everywhere, as though the droid were wearing a much-mended garment. Copper patches, gold-colored patches, steel-colored patches, and one round silvery one on the top of its head. Han could still hear the droid's voice in his mind. 8GN had something wrong with its speakers, and its voice had alternated between sounding deep and an unctuous to shrill mechanical squeakiness. But no matter how much the droid sounded, they'd all paid attention to what 8GN said. Now, dear children, have you all got your territory assignments? The copper-colored droid swiveled its head a little, rustily on its pipe-stem neck, regarding the 8 children from Trader's Luck as they stood ranged before it. All of the children, including 5-year-old Han, affirmed that they did, indeed have their territories. Very well then, dear children, the droid continued in its deep, then squeaky tones. Let me now give you your job assignments. Padra, the droid looked down at a small boy only a year or so older than Han. Today we're going to give you your first chance to show us how helpful you can be to these poor citizens who are burdened with credit vouchers, jewelry, and expensive private comlinks. The droid's eyes glittered eerily. They were different colors. One had burned out long ago, and Shrike had replaced it with a lens scavenged from a junked droid, giving HGN one red eye and one green. Are you willing to help out these poor, benighted citizens, Padra? HGN asked, cocking its metal head inquiringly, its voice dripping artificial camaraderie. Sure am, the boy cried. He gave Han and the other small children a triumphant glance. No more baby begging for me, he whispered excitedly. Han, who was barely beginning to learn the skills necessary to pick pockets swiftly and undetectably, felt a stir of envy. Excuse me. Grab a drink real quick here. And check something here with Streamlabs. There we go. That's better. Let's see. Picking pockets was easy once you learned how to do it well. It was far easier to meet HGN's quota for a day's work picking pockets than it was by begging. Begging required a costing at least 3 marks, roughly, in order to gain 1 donation. But pickpocketing, now that was the best way to earn big money. If you chose the right mark, you could gain enough in 1 grab to give HGN your quota before noon, and then you were free to play. Han wondered whether HGN would give him some practice time if he hurried and begged his quota for the day before the others finished. It was fun to practice with the spindly reddish droid because HGN looked so funny in clothes. The droid would put on street clothes typical to the planet they were on, and then either stand still or stroll past a student. Han had learned to relieve the droid of the concealed chrono, credit vouchers, and even some kinds of jewelry without HGN detecting his fingers in the process. But he couldn't do it 100% of the time. Han scowled a little as he trudged away. HGN demanded perfection from its little band, especially from the pickpockets. The droid wouldn't let him start picking pockets until he was sure of that, or it was sure that Han could do so perfectly every time. Absently, he picked up a handful of dirt and rubbed it into his hands, then smeared his already sweating face. What planet was this, anyways? He couldn't recall hearing the name. The native people were greenish-skinned, with small, swivelly ears and huge dark purple eyes. Han had only learned a few words in their language, but he was a quick study, and he knew that by the time Trader's luck moved on, he'd be able to understand it well and speak it, at least the gutter argot passably. Whatever this was, it was hot and humid. Han glanced up at the pale greenish-blue sky, in which blazed a pale orange sun. The prospect of spending several hours on this appointed street whining, begging, and cajoling passers-by for alms wasn't an attractive one. When I get a little older, I'm going to make them let me steal instead of beg. I'm sure I'll be a good thief, and I'm not that good a beggar. He knew his appearance was all right. He'd gotten taller in the past couple years, but he was still underweight enough to be called skinny, and he knew how to make his voice servile, his manner cringing and cowering, as though only desperation were driving him to plead for alms. Maybe it was his eyes, Han thought. Maybe the secret resentment and shame he felt at having to beg showed in them, and potential marks could see it. Nobody respected a beggar, and Han, more than almost anything, had an undeclared desire to be respected. Not just respected, he wanted to be respectable. He couldn't recall much about his life before Garrus Shrike had found him begging on Corellia, but Han somehow knew that once upon a time things had been different. Long ago he'd been taught to believe that begging was shameful, and that stealing was worse. Han bit his lip angrily. He knew that someone, perhaps the parents he couldn't remember, had taught him these things. Once, long ago, he'd been taught different ways, different values. But now, what could he do? Aboard Trader's Luck, there was one cardinal rule. If you didn't work, you begged or stole. If you refused to work, beg, or steal, you didn't eat. Han had no other skills to offer. He was too little to pilot, not strong enough to load smuggled cargo. But I won't always be, he reminded himself. I'm growing every day. Soon I'm going to be big. In just 5 more years, I'll be 10. And then maybe I'll be big enough to pilot. Han had discovered that when he made up his mind to accomplish something, he could do it. He was sure that piloting would be no exception. And when I can pilot, that'll be my way off Trader's Luck, he thought, his mind slipping automatically into an old dream, one that he never told anyone about. Once he'd confided it to one of the other children, and the little Vrelt blabbed it to everyone. Shrike and the others laughed at Han for weeks, calling him Captain Han of the Imperial Navy, until Han wanted to crawl away, hands over his ears. It took all his control to just shrug and pretend not to care. Yeah, and when I'm the best pilot around, and I've made lots of credits, I'll apply to the Imperial Academy. I'll become a naval officer. Then I'll come back and get Shrike, arrest him, and he'll get sent to the spice mines on Kessel. He'll die there. The thought made Han's mouth curl up in a predatory smile. At the far end of his fantasy, Han pictured himself successful, respected, the best pilot in the galaxy, with a ship of his own, lots of loyal friends, and plenty of credits. And a family. Yeah, a family of his own. Beautiful wife who adored him, who'd share adventures with him, and kids maybe. He'd be a good father. He wouldn't abandon his children the way he'd been abandoned. At least, Han supposed that he'd been abandoned, though he couldn't remember a thing about it. He didn't even know his last name, so he couldn't try to trace his family. Or maybe his parents hadn't abandoned him. Maybe they'd been killed, or he'd been kidnapped away from them. Han decided that he preferred that scenario. If he thought of his parents as dead, he wasn't so mad at them, because people couldn't help it if they died, right? Han decided that from now on, he'd think of his mother and father as dead. It was easier that way. He knew he'd probably never know the real truth. The only person who knew anything about Han's background was Garrus Shrike. The captain kept telling Han that if he was good, if he worked and begged hard, if he earned enough credits, someday Shrike would tell him the secrets behind how he'd come to be wandering the streets of Corellia that day. Han's mouth tightened. Sure, Captain, he thought. Just like you were going to get Denalis's face fixed. The child glanced up at the street signs. He couldn't read the ones in the native language, but there was a basic translation beneath each. Yeah, this was his territory, all right. Han took a deep breath, then rearranged his features. A green-skinned female clad in a short robe was coming toward him. Lady, he whined, cringing his way toward her. Little hand held out in appeal. Please, beautiful, gracious lady, I beg your help. Alms, just one little credit. I'm so hungry. The little cupped green ears swiveled toward him, then she averted her head and swept past. Under his breath, Han muttered an uncomplimentary term in smuggler's argot, then turned to wait for the next mark. Han shook his head and forced himself out of his reverie. Time to go check on the Elysian Dream's progress. So now we're back to present time. Hauling himself up out of his cubbyhole, the young pilot made his way through the cramped passageways until he reached the bridge. The astromech droid was still there, its lights flashing away as it thought its own thoughts. It was a relatively new R2 unit, still shiny, bright, silver and green, with a clear dome atop its head. Inside the dome, Han could see lights blinking as it worked. It was hooked into the ship's robot controls by means of a cable. The R2 droid must have been equipped with a motion sensor because it swiveled its domed head toward Han as he clumped boldly onto the bridge in the spacesuit. The lights flashed frantically as it talked, but of course the sound waves didn't travel in vacuum. Han turned on his ship's communication unit, and suddenly his helmet was filled with distressed bleeps, blurps, and weeps. The R2 astromech announced several weeps and bleeps and blurps, and evident surprise. Han looked around for its counterpart droid and didn't see one. He sighed. His suit's communicator would transmit what he said to the droid, but how was he supposed to actually talk to the to the concerned R2 unit without an interpreter. How did whoever had programmed the droid talk to it? He activated his suit's communicator. Hey, you. Blurp, we bleep were, the unit replied helpfully. Han scowled and cursed at the unit in Rhodian Trader Argot, and finally Basic. What am I going to do now? He snarled. If only you had a basic speech module. But I do, sir, announced the droid in a matter-of-fact voice. Its words were flat, mechanical, but Hey, and we're back. Sorry about that. Twitch is having a couple issues there. Couldn't really connect. But it looks like everything is back on. Just going to test to make sure this is working. All right, perfect. Okay. Let's see, where were we? Let's see. Let's take it back a little bit in case you missed any of this. Han gaped at the machine for a moment, then grinned. Hey, this is a first. How come you can talk? Because there was not room aboard this vessel for both an astromech unit and a counterpart unit. My masters programmed me with a basic speech transmission module so I could communicate more easily. The droid replied. Alright, Han cried, feeling a surge of relief. He didn't like droids much, but at least he'd have someone to talk to, and it might actually prove necessary for the two of them to communicate. Space travel was usually routine and safe, but there were exceptions. I regret, sir, the R2 added, that you are guilty of unauthorized entry, sir. You are not supposed to be here. I know that, Han said. I hitched a ride on this ship. I beg your pardon. This unit does not understand the term used, sir. Han called the R2 unit an uncomplimentary name. I beg your pardon. This unit does not understand... Shut up, Han bellowed. The R2 unit was silent. Han took a very deep breath. Okay, R2, he said. I am a stowaway. Is that word in your memory banks? Yes it is, sir. Good. I stowed away aboard the ship because I needed a ride to Alesia. I'm going to take a job piloting for the Alessian priests, understand? Yes, sir. However, I must inform you that in my capacity as a watch droid, assigned to safeguard this vessel and its contents, I must seal all the exits when we reach Alesia. Then inform my masters that you are aboard, thus expediting your capture by their security staff. Hey, little pal, Han said generously. When we reach Alesia, you just go right ahead and do that. When the priests see that I fit all their requirements, they won't give a vrelt's butt how I arrived there. I beg your pardon, sir, but this unit does not... Shut up. Han glanced down at his air pack readout, then said, Okay, R2. I'd like to check on our flight path, speed, and ETA to Alesia. Please display that information. I regret, sir, that I am not authorized to give you that information. Han was coming to a slow boil. He barely restrained himself from kicking the reluctant droid from his heavy space boot. Or with his heavy space boot. I need to check our flight path, speed, and ETA because I've got to compute how my air is holding out, he explained with exaggerated patience. I beg your pardon, sir, but this unit... Shut up! Han was starting to sweat now, and the suit's refrigeration unit revved up a little faster. He struggled to keep his tones calm. Listen carefully, R2, he said. Don't you have some kind of operating system program that orders you to attempt to preserve the lives of intelligent beings whenever you can? Yes, sir, that programming is included with all astromech droids. For a droid to deliberately harm or fail to prevent harm to a sentient being, its operating system module must be altered. Good, Han said. That fit in with what he knew about astromech programming. Listen to me. If you don't show me your flight path, speed, and ETA, you may be responsible for my death from lack of air. Do you understand me now? Please elaborate, sir. Han explained with exaggerated patience his situation. When he finished, the droid was silent for a moment, evidently calculating. finally at word once, then said, "I will comply with your request, sir, and will display the information requested on the diagnostic interface screen." Han breathed a long sigh of relief. Since the ship was basically a giant robot drone, it had no controls visible on its control boards, just assorted blinking lights. But in order to service the ship, there was a screen built into the control board. Han stepped carefully around the R2 unit and stared down at the screen. Information scrolled across it so rapidly no human could have read it. He turned to the R2 unit. "Put that data back up and this time leave it there until I can read it. Get it?" Yes, sir." The droid's artificial voice sounded almost meek. Han studied the figures and diagram that appeared on the screen for several minutes, feeling his uneasiness grow into real fear. He had nothing to write with and no way to access the Navicomputer, but he had a bad feeling about what he was seeing. Biting his lip, he forced himself to concentrate as he ran the figures in his head over and over. Elysian Dream's flight path had been set to take it in a circuitous route to the planet in order to avoid the worst of the pirate-infested areas of the Hutt space. And the little freighter's speed was set far lower than the ship was capable of, slower even than even Trader's Luck normally traveled. Not good. Not good at all. If their speed and course weren't altered, Han realized, he'd run out of air about 5 hours before the Dream set down on Elysian soil. The ship would land with a corpse aboard. His. He turned back to the R2 unit. "Listen, R2, you've got to help me. If I don't alter our course and speed, I won't have sufficient air to make the trip. I'll die and it'll be your fault." The R2's unit's lights flashed as the machine contemplated this revelation. Finally it said, "But I did not know you were on board, sir. I cannot be held responsible for your death." "Oh no." Han shook his head inside his helmet. "It doesn't work that way, R2. If you know about the situation and do nothing, then you will be causing the death of a sentient being. Is that what you want?" "No," the droid said. Even its artificial tones sounded faintly strained, and its lights flickered rapidly and erratically. "Then it follows," Han continued, "that you must do whatever you can to prevent my death, right?" I... The droid was quivering now in agitation. "Sir, I am constrained from assisting you. My programming is in conflict with my hardware." "What do you mean?" Han was worried now. If the little droid overloaded and went dead, he'd never be able to access the manual diagnostic controls that he knew had to be in these panels somewhere. They'd be tiny, something for the techs to use to test the robot drone's autopilot. "My programming is constraining me from informing you." Han took one huge stride over to the little droid and knelt in front of it. "Blast you!" He pounded his fist on top of the droid's clear dome. "I'll die! Tell me!" Droid rocked agitatedly, and Han wondered if it would simply fall apart with the strain. But then it said, "I have been fitted with a restraining bolt, sir. It prevents me from complying with your request." A restraining bolt! Han seized onto this bit of information with alacrity. "Let's see, where is it?" After a moment, he spotted it, low down on the droid's metal carapace. He reached down, grasped it, and tugged. Nothing. The bolt didn't move. Han gripped harder, tried twisting. He grunted with effort, really sweating now, imagining he could feel those molecules of oxygen running out in a steady stream. He'd heard that hypoxia wasn't an especially bad way to die, compared to explosive decompression or being shot, for example, but he had no desire to find out firsthand. The bolt didn't move. Han tried harder, jerking at it, swearing in half a dozen alien tongues, but the stubborn thing didn't budge. "Gotta find something I can hit it with," Han thought, glancing wildly around the control cabin. But there was nothing, not a hydrospanner, a wrench, nothing. Suddenly he remembered the blaster. He'd left it on the floor in his little cubicle. "Wait right here," Han instructed the R2 unit, and then he was squeezing back through the narrow corridors. Shooting a blaster inside a spaceship, even an unpressurized spaceship, wasn't a good idea, but he was desperate. Han returned with the weapon and examined the settings. Lowest setting, he thought. Narrowest beam. Clumsy in his spacesuit gloves, he had trouble adjusting the power setting and beam width. The R2's lights had been flashing frantically ever since he'd returned, and now it weeped plaintively. Sir, may I ask what you're doing?" I am getting rid of that restraining bolt, Han told it grimly. Aiming and narrowing his eyes, he squeezed it delicately. A flash of energy erupted, and the little droid weeped so shrilly it sounded like a scream. The restraining bolt fell to the deck, leaving behind a black burn scar on the otherwise shining metal of the R2 unit. Gotcha, Han said with satisfaction. Now, R2, be good enough to point me toward the manual interfaces and controls in your ship here. The droid obediently extruded a mobile wheeled leg and rolled over to the control banks, its interface cable trailing behind it. Han went over and crouched before the instrument panel, awkward in his suit. Following the droid's instructions, he wrenched off the top of one featureless control panel and studied the tiny bank of controls. Cursing at the awkwardness of trying to manipulate the controls while wearing spacesuit gloves, Han began using the manual interface mode to disengage the hyperdrive. Altering course and speed could only be done in real space. Once they were back in real space, Han painstakingly computed a new course using the R2 unit to perform the more esoteric calculations for the jump that would send them back into hyperspace. It took the young Corellian a while to lay in their new course and speed, but finally Han triggered the hyperdrive engage switch again. A second later, he felt the lurch as the drive kicked in. Han clung grimly to the instrument panel as the ship hurtled into hyperspace on its new course at a greatly increased rate of speed. As the ship steadied around him, Han drew a long, long breath and let it out very slowly. He slumped to the deck and sat there, his legs stuck out before him. Whew! You realize, sir, said the R2 unit, that you will now have to land this craft manually. Altering our course and speed has invalidated the existing landing protocols programmed into the ship. Yeah, I know, Han said, leaning wearily back against the console. He took another sip of water and then ate 2 tablets. But there's no other way. I just hope I can work the controls fast enough to land us. He glanced around him at the nearby featureless control room. I wish this bucket of bolts came with a view screen. An autopilot cannot see, sir, so visual data is useless to it, the R2 unit pointed out helpfully. No, Han said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I thought droids could see just like we can. No, sir, we cannot, R2 told him. We recognize our surroundings by visual relays that translate into electronic data within our... Shut up, Han said, too tired even to enjoy baiting the droid. Leaning back against the console, he closed his eyes. He'd done all that he could to save his life by bringing the ship to Alesia on a much more direct route, at a faster speed. Han drifted into sleep and dreamed of Dulana as she had been long ago, when they'd first known each other. Han was halfway through the window when he heard the shout behind him. We've been robbed! This is the dream sequence. Clutching his small sack of loot, he kicked, wriggling, trying to squeeze through the narrow enclosure. In the dark outside lay safety. A feminine cry of dismay. My jewelry! Han grunted with effort, realizing he was stuck. He fought back panic. He had to get away. This was a rich house, and when someone summoned the authorities, they were certain to come immediately. Silently, he cursed the new vogue in Corellian architecture that had caused this luxurious home to be built with floor-to-ceiling narrow windows. The windows were advertised as being able to thwart burglars. Well, there might be some truth to that, he decided grimly. He'd sneaked in earlier through one of the doors that led to the gardens, then hidden out until he felt safe in believing that all the inhabitants were asleep. Then he'd ventured out to pick and choose among their treasures. He'd been confident that he could wiggle his skinny 9-year-old self through those windows and make good his escape. Han grunted with effort again, kicking frantically. It was possible he was wrong about that. A voice behind him, the woman, There he is! Get him! Han turned a little more sideways, wriggled violently, and then suddenly he was through the window, and falling. He didn't let go of his sack, though, as he crashed down onto the manicured bed of flowering dwarva vines. Breath whooshed out of his lungs, and for a moment he just lay there gasping, like a Drell out of water. His leg hurt, and so did his head. Call the security patrol! The masculine shout came from inside. Han knew he had only seconds to make good his escape. Forcing his leg to bear his weight, he rolled over and staggered to his feet. Trees ahead in the moonlight, big ones. He could lose himself in them easy. Han half limped, half ran to the shelter of the trees. He resolved not to let 8GN know what had happened. The droid might accuse him of slowing down now that he was going on 10. Han grimaced as he ran. He wasn't slowing down, he just hadn't been feeling well today. He'd had a dull headache ever since he'd awakened, and had been tempted to turn himself in on sick call. Since Han was almost never ill, he'd probably have been believed, but he didn't like showing weakness in front of other denizens of Trader's Luck, especially Captain Shrike. The man never missed an opportunity to ride him. He was in the shelter of the trees now. What next? He could hear the sound of running footsteps, so he didn't have much time to decide. His muscle made that decision for him. Suddenly the sack was clenched in his teeth, and there was bark against his palms, and the soles of his beat-up boots were braced against branches. Han climbed, listened, then climbed again. Only when he was high in the tree, above the range of a casual glance by pursuers, did he slow down. Han settled back on a limb against the tree trunk, panting, his head whirling. He felt dizzy, nauseated, and for a moment he was afraid he'd be sick and give himself away. But he bit his lip and forced himself to stay still, and presently he felt a little better. Judging from the star patterns, it was only a few hours until dawn. Han realized that he was going to have trouble making the rendezvous with the Luck shuttle. Would Shrike just abandon him, or would he wait? Far below him, people were searching the wooded area. Light strobed the night, and he huddled close to the tree trunk, eyes closed, clinging desperately despite his dizziness. If only his head didn't throb so. Han wondered whether they'd bring in bioscanners and shivered. His skin felt hot and tight even though the night was cool and breezy. Dark waned on toward dawn. Han wondered what Dulana was doing, whether she'd miss him if the Luck left orbit without him. Finally the lights went out, and the footsteps faded away. Han waited another 20 minutes to make sure his pursuers were truly gone. Then, holding the sack gripped in his teeth, he carefully climbed down, moving with exaggerated care because his head hurt so much. Every jar, even walking, made his head swim, and he had to grit his teeth against the pain. He walked and walked. Several times he realized he'd been dozing while he walked, and a couple of times he fell down and was tempted to just stay there. But something kept him moving. As dawn brightened the streets and houses around him. Corellian dawns were beautiful. Han noticed dazedly. He'd never before noticed how pretty the colors were in the sky. If only the light didn't hurt his eyes so much. Dawn turned to day. Cool gave way to warmth, then heat. He was sweating, and his vision was blurred, but finally there it was, the spaceport. By this time, Han was moving like an automaton, one foot in front of the other, wishing he could lie down and sleep in the road. Before him now, the Luck shuttle. With a gasp that was nearly a sob, the boy drove himself forward. He was almost to the ramp when a tall figure emerged. Shrike. "Where in the blazes you been?" There was nothing friendly in the captain's grasp upon his arm. Han held up the sack, and Shrike grabbed it. "Well, at least you didn't come back empty-handed," the captain grumbled. Quickly he sifted through the contents, nodding his satisfaction. Only when he was finished did Shrike seem to notice that Han was swaying on his feet. "What's wrong with you?" Now beyond coherent speech, Han could only shake his head. Consciousness was fading in and out on him like a jammed transmission. Shrike shook him a little, then put a hand on the boy's forehead. When he felt the heat, he cursed. "Fever. Should I leave you here? What if it's contagious?" He frowned, clearly struggling to decide. Finally, he hefted the sack of loot again. "Guess you've earned a sick day, kid," he muttered. "Come on." Han tried to make it up the ramp, but then he stumbled and everything went dark. He swam up into partial consciousness a long time later to the sound of voices arguing, one in Wookiee, the other in Basic, Dulana and Shrike. The Wookiee growled insistently. "I could tell he's really sick," Shrike agreed, "but you can't kill one of my kids with a blaster set on full." He'll be okay after a couple of days' rest. He doesn't need a medical droid, and I'm not springing for it." Dulana snarled, and Han, automatically translating, was surprised at how insistent the Wookiee was being. He felt a furred paw hand lay something cold on his forehead. It felt wonderful against the heat. I told you no, Dulana, and I meant it, Shrike said. And with that, the captain stomped out, cursing the Wookiee in every language he knew. Han opened his eyes to see Dulana bending over him. The Wookiee rumbled gently at him. Han struggled to speak. Pretty bad, he conceded in response to her question. Thirsty. Dulana held him up and gave him water, sip by slow sip. She told him that he had a high fever, so high that she was afraid for him. When Han finished the water, she stooped down and scooped the child up into her arms. Where are we? She told him to hush, that she was taking him planet-side to the medical droid. Han's head was swimming, but he made a great effort. Don't Captain Shrike really mad? Her answer was short and to the point. Han had never heard her curse before. He faded in and out as they moved through the corridors, and his next clear memory was of being strapped into the seat of a shuttle. Han had never known Dulana could pilot, but she handled the controls competently with her huge, furred hands. The shuttle slipped loose from its moorings and then accelerated toward Corellia. The fever was making Han lightheaded, and he kept imagining that he heard Shrike's voice cursing. He tried to say something about it to Dulana, but found he didn't have the strength to get the words out. He next regained consciousness in the medical droid's waiting room. Dulana was sitting down with Han's scrawny form still clutched protectively in her arms. Suddenly a door opened and the droid appeared. It was a large, elongated droid equipped with anti-grav units so that it floated around its patient. As Dulana placed Han on the examining table, Han felt a prick against his skin as the droid took a blood sample. Do you understand basic, madam? Inquired the droid. For a moment, Han was about to answer that of course he understood basic, and who was madam, but then Dulana rumbled. Oh, of course, the medical unit was talking to her. This young patient has contracted Corellian Tanneman fever, the droid told Dulana. His case is quite severe. It is fortunate that you did not wait any longer to bring him to me. I will need to keep him here and observe him until tomorrow. Do you wish to stay with him? Dulana rumbled her assent. Very well, madam. I am going to use back-to immersion therapy to restore his metabolic equilibrium. That will also bring his fever down. Han took one look at the waiting back-to tank and feebly tried to make a run for the door. Between them, Dulana and the medical unit restrained him easily. The boy felt another needle prick his arm, and then the whole universe tilted sideways and slid into blackness. Han opened his eyes, realizing his reverie had turned into sleep, then dreams. He shook his head, remembering how wobbly he'd been when Dulana and the droid helped him out of the back tank. Then Dulana paid the droid out of her own small store of credits and piloted them back to Trader's Luck. The young pilot grimaced. Boy, Shrike had been mad. Han was worried that he'd space them both, but Dulana never showed even the slightest sign of fear as she stood between the captain and Han, insisting that she'd done the right thing, that otherwise the boy would have died. In the end, Shrike subsided because one of the pieces of jewelry Han had stolen that night turned out to be set with a genuine crate dragon pearl. When the captain discovered what it was worth, he was mollified. But he didn't pay Dulana back for Han's medical bills. Han sighed and closed his eyes. Dulana's loss was like a knife wound. No matter how he tried, he couldn't get away from the pain and the memories. He'd let down his guard and suddenly find himself thinking of her as still alive, visualize himself talking to her, telling her about his troubles with the R2 unit, only to be brought up short with pain nearly as searing and immediate as he'd felt yesterday when he'd held her dying body. Han swallowed another sip of water, trying to ease the tightness in his throat. He owed Dulana, owed her so much, his life, even his true identity. He owed Dulana for that, too. Han sighed. Until he was 11 years old, his only name had been Han. The boy often wondered and worried about whether he had a last name. One time he mentioned his concern to Dulana, along with his conviction that if anyone knew who he really was, it was Shrike. Very soon after that, Dulana learned to play Sabak. Okay. Han heard the soft scratch on the door to his tiny cubicle and woke instantly. Listening, he heard the scratch again, then a soft whine. I believe this is a dream. That's in different text. This book uses italics a lot to show that this was a memory or a dream, but it's kind of hard to relay that reading it aloud, so I'll just let you know when it's that text. So in italics, Han heard the soft scratch on the door to his tiny cubicle and woke instantly. Listening, he heard the scratch again, then a soft whine. "Dulana," he whispered, sliding out of bed and sticking his bare feet into his ship's coveralls. "Is that you?" She rumbled softly from outside the door. Han yanked up his jumpsuit, sealed it, and opened the door. "What do you mean you have exciting news for me?" Dulana came in, her huge furred body fairly bouncing with excitement. Han waved her past him, and she sat on the narrow bunk. Since there was no place else to sit, Han settled down beside her. The Wookiee cautioned him to keep his voice low, and glancing at the chrono, Han realized it was the dead of night. "What are you doing up now?" he asked, puzzled. "Don't tell me you were playing Sabak this late." She nodded at him, her blue eyes sparkling with excitement amid her tan and chestnut hair. "So what's going on, Dulana? Why did you need to talk to me?" She rumbled softly at him. Han sat up straight, suddenly transfixed. "You found out my last name? How?" Her answer was a single name, Shrike. Han muttered, "Well, if anyone knows it's him, how did it happen? What's my name?" His name, she told him, was Solo. Shrike had gotten very, very drunk, and he started bragging about how much the Great Dragon Pearl was worth. What a good deal he'd gotten when he sold it. Dulana asked Shrike innocently if Han came from a long line of successful thieves. Shrike, she reported, exploded into laughter at the suggestion. "Maybe some branches of the family, but this Solo?" He sputtered, wheezing with merriment, pausing to gulp more Alderaanian ale. "I'm afraid not, Dulana. This kid's folks were—" And at that point the captain suddenly halted in mid-word, fixing the Wookiee with a suspicious glare. "So why do you care, anyhow?" he demanded, his momentary good humor gone. Dulana answered only by covering Shrike's bet and raising. "Solo," Han whispered softly, trying it on for size. "Han Solo. My full name is Han Solo." He looked up at Dulana, and a wide grin spread across his features. "I like it. It sounds great." Dulana whined softly, and slinging a long arm around him, gave the boy a hug. Han smiled, remembering all of this, but it was a sad smile. Dulana had meant well, but her discovery that his name was Solo had led to one of the worst episodes of his young life. The next time the Luck was in orbit around Corellia, he'd stolen time away from his pickpocketing and burglary duties, and had gone to one of the public archives to do some research. Shrike didn't like his rescuees spend any time on furthering their education. Each child aboard Trader's Luck was given an elementary-level education via the ship's computer, so he, she, or it could learn to read and count money. Beyond that, Shrike discouraged the children from pursuing higher learning. It was partly because he automatically wanted to flout Shrike's wishes, and partly due to Dulana's encouragement that Han had kept up his studies in secret. He had a tendency to ignore subjects he didn't like, such as history, and to spend all his time on subjects he enjoyed, such as reading adventure stories and solving math equations. Han knew how important math was to anyone who wanted to be a pilot, so he worked hard at mastering as much of it as he could. Once Dulana discovered what he was doing, she monitored his curriculum, making him study subjects that he would otherwise have skipped, leaving gaps in his knowledge. Reluctantly, Han tackled the physical sciences and history. He was surprised to discover that some real historical battles were just as exciting as anything he'd read in adventure sagas. That day in the public archives on Corellia, Han applied some of his newly learned research skills to learn about his new surname. The results were surprising. When Han looked up the last name Solo in the historical records, he was astounded to discover that the name was well known on Corellia. A Berthron E. Solo had introduced democracy on Han's homeworld 3 centuries ago. He'd actually been a ruler, a king. But there'd been another Solo, more recently, who was equally famous, or to put it more accurately, infamous. About 50 years ago, a descendant of Berthron, Corral Solo, had fathered a son named Dalla Solo. The young man, taking the alias Dalla Sul, in an effort to disguise his identity, had made quite a name for himself as a murderer, kidnapper, and pirate. Dalla the Black had become a name to make children quake in their beds on lonely outpost colonies or tramp freighters. The child Han wondered whether he was related to these men. Did royal blood run in his veins, or the blood of a pirate murderer? He'd probably never know unless somehow he could persuade Shrike to divulge what he knew. He read about Dala Sul's exploits as a thief and smiled grimly, wondering if he was actually following some kind of family tradition. Then he began checking the more recent Corellian news files and society pages in the computer. Search for the surname Solo brought up a name, Tion Sal Solo. She was a wealthy but reclusive widow with one child, a son, Thraken Sal Solo. He was 6 or 7 years older than Han in his late teens. What if I'm related to this Tion Solo, or she knew my parents? Han wondered. This could be my best chance yet to get away. When he went back to Trader's Luck, Han talked it over with Dulana. The Wookiee agreed with him that while it was risky, Han had to take the chance at contacting the Solo family. Of course, Han said, resting his chin on his fist and looking dejectedly at the table. Once I did that, I couldn't see you again, Dulana. The Wookiee growled softly, telling Han that of course he'd see her, just not aboard Trader's Luck. The last time I ran away, Shrike beat me so hard I couldn't sit down for days, Han said softly. If Laird hadn't reminded him that he had something else to do, I really think he might have killed me. Dulana rumbled. You're right, Han agreed. If this Solo family takes me in, they're powerful enough and rich enough to protect me from Shrike. Han even knew something about the rules and manners required of people living in Corellian high society. Every so often, Shrike would run a major scam on rich folks on Corellia. Han had been part of the background during several such con operations. Shrike would rent a wealthy estate on Corellia and then set up a family unit to provide a respectable backdrop to the scam. Just a few weeks past, Han had been attending such a school so well known that it had merited a visit from the famous Senator Garm Bel Iblis. Han had raised his hand and asked the senator 2 questions that had been insightful and intelligent enough to make the senator really notice him. After class was over, Bel Iblis had stopped Han, shaken his hand, and asked him his name. Han had glanced around quickly, seeing that nobody else was within earshot, and proudly told the senator his real name. It had felt great to be able to do that. Shrike recruited Han frequently for his scan operations, partly because of the boy's easygoing charm and winning smile, and partly because Han's clandestine studies made him fit into his grade level better than most of the other children. Han had also gained a small reputation as an up-and-coming swoop and speeder pilot, a rich man's sport, if there ever was one. He'd met lots of kids from wealthy families while swoop racing, and several times Shrike had managed to lure their parents into whatever scam he was currently running. In a year, Han would be eligible to race in Corellia's junior championship division. That would mean big prize money if he won. Han both liked and disliked these assignments. He liked them because he got to live in the lap of luxury for weeks, sometimes months. Swoop and speeder racing was life and breath to him, and he got to practice every day. He disliked these con operations because he always wound up caring about some of the kids he was ordered to befriend, and all the while he knew they and their families would be irrevocably injured by Shrike's scheme. Mostly, Han managed to stifle any guilty feelings he felt. He was becoming good at putting himself first. Other people, with the sole exception of Dulana, had to come second or not at all. It was self-preservation, and Han was very, very good at that. I still am, Han thought as he got up from the deck of the Elysian Dream and went to check on the course and speed. The young Corellian smiled and nodded as he read the instrument readings. Right in the groove, he thought. We're going to make it. He checked his air pack, seeing it was more than half gone. For a moment, Han was tempted to explore the dream further, but he resisted the impulse. Moving around would just cause him to use up his oxygen faster, and he was skirting the edge of safety as it was. So he settled back down, and the memories came back. Aunt Tion, poor woman, and dear Cousin Thraken, as he remembered. Han's lip pulled back from his teeth in a feral grin that was more like a canoid snarl. Remembering again, Han swung down off the high stone wall and landed lightly on the balls of his feet. Through the trees he could see a large structure built of the same native stone as the wall, so he headed toward it, staying in the tree shadow wherever possible. When he reached the house, he halted, staring at it in amazement. He'd seen a lot of rich mansions, even lived in more than a few, but he'd never seen anything like the Sal Solo estate. Towers festooned with creeping vines, 4 of them stood at each corner of a large square stone building. An ancient gardener droid moved about arthritically, pruning the bushes that grew down to the edge of a large trench filled with water. Han walked around to the side and saw, to his surprise, the stretch of water completely surrounded the house. There was no way to enter the place except across a narrow wooden bridge that spanned the water and led up to the front door. Han had been interested in military tactics ever since he was small, and he'd read up on them. He studied the Sal Solo mansion, realizing it was built to almost military fortress standards of impregnability. Well, that sort of fit in with what he'd read about the Solo family. They didn't socialize, didn't attend charity events, or go to plays or concerts. In all the times he'd posed as a rich kid, he'd never heard anyone mention the Solo family, and the way those rich people talked about each other, he'd have heard something if they ever mingled with their peers. Han walked cautiously toward the house. He'd exchanged his ship's gray jumpsuit for a borrowed pair of black pants and a pale gray tunic. He didn't want anyone finding out where he'd come from. When he was nearly to the beginning of the causeway, he stood behind one of the large ornamental bushes and warily peered across the water to the house. Excuse me. What should he do now? Just walk up and activate the door signal? He bit his lip, undecided. What if they called the authorities on him, reported him as a runaway? Shrike would descend on him so fast. Gotcha. Han gasped and jumped as a hand closed over his upper arm, hauling him around bodily. The person who'd grabbed him was head and shoulders taller than the younger boy. He had darker hair than Han and was stockier as well. But it was his face that made Han stand staring at him in blank amazement. Han gaped, speechless at the older boy. If he had ever doubted that he was related to the Solo family, those doubts died in an instant death. The face of the youth who was holding his arm looked like an older version of the face Han saw in the mirror every morning. Not that they were twins or anything, but there was too much resemblance in their features to be coincidence. The same shape of the brown eyes, the same kind of lips, same quirk to the eyebrows, same nose and same jawline. The other boy was gaping back at Han, having evidently noticed the same thing. Hey! He shook Han's arm roughly. Who are you? My name is Han Solo, Han replied steadily. You must be Thraken Sal Solo. So what if I am? The other said sullenly. Han was beginning to feel uneasy about the way the boy was eyeing him. He'd seen Vrelts with more warmth in their eyes. Han Solo, eh? I've never heard of you. Where do you come from? Who's your mother and father? I was hoping you could tell me that, Han said evenly. I ran away from where I was staying because I wanted to find my family. I don't know anything about myself except my name. Huh. Thraken was still staring. Well, I guess you must be one of the family. Looks like it, Han agreed, not realizing until he spoke that it was a pun. But Thraken didn't appear to notice. He seemed mesmerized by Han and released his grip on the other's arm, walked around him, studying him from every angle. Where did you run away from? Thraken asked. Will anyone come looking for you? No, Han said shortly. He wasn't about to trust Thraken with anything that could come back to haunt him. Listen, he said, we look alike, so we must be related, right? Could we be brothers? Funny, but after all his dreaming about finding a family that would rescue him from the traitor's luck, Han found himself hoping this wasn't the case. Not a chance, Thraken said with a curl of his lip. My dad died a year after I was born, and my mom shut herself up here ever since. She's kind of a loner. That fit with what Han had read about the Sal Solo family. Tion Solo had married a man named Randall Sal, some 20 years ago. Public records had carried his obituary. Maybe she'd known something about me, Han said. Could I see her? He took a deep breath. Please? Thraken seemed to consider. Okay, he said finally, but if she gets upset, you've got to leave, okay? Mom doesn't like people. She's like her grandfather, won't have human servants, just droids. She says humans betray and kill each other, and droids never do. Han followed Thraken into the huge house, through rooms full of shrouded furniture, and paintings draped against dust. The family, Thraken explained, used only a few rooms to save the cleaning droid's time and effort. Finally, they came to Thraken's mother's sitting room. Tian Solo was a pale, dark-haired woman, plump and unhealthy-looking. She was far from attractive. But looking at her, studying her face, seeing the bones beneath the puffy flab, Han thought that once, long ago, she might have been beautiful. Seeing her features, a memory stirred within him, so faint. Once he'd seen features similar to hers, Han thought. Long ago, far away, the memory, if memory it was as fleeting and elusive as a drift of smoke. Mother, Thraken said, this is Han Solo. He's related to us, isn't he? Tian Sal Solo's gaze traveled to Han's face, and her eyes widened in distress. She stared at the boy in horror. Her mouth worked, and a thin, shrill mewling sound emerged. No! No! She cried. Tears gathered in her brown eyes, coursed down her flabby cheeks. No, it isn't possible! He's gone! They're both gone! Burying her face in her hands, she began to weep hysterically. Thraken grabbed Han by the arm and dragged him out of the house. Now look what you did, you little idiot, the youth said, glancing uneasily up at his mother's window. She'll be a mess for days. She always is when she gets like that. Han shrugged. I didn't do anything. She just looked at me, that's all. What's wrong with that? Or what's wrong with her? With a muffled curse, Thraken backhanded Han across the face so hard it split the younger boy's lip. Shut up, he snarled. You've got no right to talk about her. There's nothing wrong with her, hear me? Nothing. The blow stung, but Han had been hit often by experts, and one thing he knew was how to take a punch and stay on his feet. For a moment he was tempted to fly at the older boy's throat, but he made himself relax. There had been genuine pain in Thraken's eyes as he defended his mother. Han figured he might have done the same thing if he'd ever had a mother. I have to stay here, he reminded himself. Anything is better than Shrike. Sorry, he managed to say. Thraken looked a little abashed. Just watch what you say about my mom, okay? The next 6 weeks were some of the strangest of Han's life. Thraken allowed Han to stay with him in his rooms. Tian almost never came into Thraken's part of the house, and the two of them spent time talking and getting to know each other. Thraken was a demanding host, Han soon learned. Han had to agree with him completely and rush to do his bidding, or he lost his temper and cuffed the younger boy. Thraken made Han pilot him around the countryside in an aging land speeder, and the two of them even went on a few expeditions to vacant estates Thraken knew about, whose inhabitants were away on vacation. Thraken would demand that Han pick the locks and disable the security systems, and then the older boy would steal whatever took his fancy. Han began to wonder whether he'd done himself any favor by running away from Trader's luck. Two things kept him at the Solo estate: his fear that if he displeased Thraken, the older boy would turn him over to the authorities, thus allowing Shrike to locate him, and his hope that Thraken would break down and tell Han everything he knew about who Han really was. He kept hinting that he knew how they might be related. All in good time, Thraken would say when Han tried to pry information out of him. All in good time, Han. Let's go flying. I want you to teach me to pilot the speeder. Han tried, but Thraken wasn't very good at it. The older boy nearly crashed them several times before he mastered even the rudiments of flying the small craft. I have to get out of here, Han kept telling himself. I'll run away to some other world where they'll never find me. Maybe I can get adopted or get a job or something. There's got to be some way. But he couldn't think of any way to get free of Thraken. The older boy was vindictive, sadistic, and just plain mean. Several times Han saw him torture insects or animals, and when he realized that his actions disturbed the younger boy, he did it frequently. Han had never had a pet, but he tended to like furred creatures because of Dulana. He missed her every day. The situation became more and more explosive until one day Thraken really lost his temper with Han. Grabbing the younger boy by the hair, he dragged him to the kitchen, picked up a knife, and held it before Han's eyes. See this? He snarled. If you don't apologize and don't do exactly what I say, I'm going to cut your ears off. Now apologize. He shook Han hard, and you'd better make me believe it. Han stared at the shining blade of the knife and wet his lips. He tried to force out words of apology, but a huge burst of red rage welled up in him. All the insults, all the cuffs and blows and beatings, Shrike's as well as Thraken's, seemed to come to a head. With a bellow as loud as a Wookiee's, Han went berserk. He slammed his fist against Thraken's arm, sending the knife flying, and slammed his other elbow into Thraken's stomach. The breath whooshed out of the older boy, and before Thraken could recover himself, Han was all over him. Kicking, biting, punching, and gouging, Han used every dirty trick he'd learned on the streets to beat up Thraken. Stunned and reeling from Han's fury, Thraken never did recover until the fight ended with Han sitting astride Thraken, holding the knife to the older boy's throat. "Hey!" Thraken's eyes glittered like a trapped velt's. "Hey, Han, stop kidding around. This isn't funny." "Neither is cutting off my ears," Han said. "Listen, I've had it. You tell me what you know, and you tell me right now, or I swear I'll cut your throat wide open. And then I'm leaving here. I've had it with you." Thraken's dark eyes were wide with fear. Something he'd seen on Han's face must have convinced the older boy that Han was so angry he'd be wise not to push him. Okay, okay. "Now," Han said, "talk." Stammering with fear, Thraken told the story. Years ago, Thraken's grandfather, Din Solo, and his grandmother, Tiragama Solo, had lived on the fifth inhabited planet in the Corellian system, a colony world called Tralis. Those were perilous times, and roving bands of raiders and pirates threatened many outlying worlds. The raiders never reached Corellia, but they reached Tralis. A fleet of them had landed and devastated the entire colony. Grandma Solo was pregnant, Thraken gasped, because it was hard to breathe with Han sitting on his chest. And the night their town was attacked, she had her babies, twins. One of them was later named Tion. Grandma Solo took her and ran away from the raiders. She managed to hide in a cave in the hills. "Tion," Han said, "your mother." "Right, the other baby was a boy. Grandma Solo said her husband took him. There hadn't even been time to name them. Grandma said it was terrible, fires everywhere and people running and screaming. Excuse me. She and Grandpa Den got separated and then rushed to escape. And?" Han flexed his hand slightly, and the blade moved against Thraken's throat. "Like I said, Grandma Solo and Tion escaped, but Grandpa Solo and the baby boy vanished. They were never heard from again. So, who does that make me?" Han said, completely baffled. "I don't know," Thraken said, "but if I had to guess, I guess that you're my cousin. That somehow Grandpa Solo and his son got away, and that you're the son of his son." "Doesn't anybody know anything but that?" Han demanded, feeling desperate. This was a total dead end. The disappointment was crushing. Servants? Grandpa Solo didn't like human servants. He always had droids. And when Grandma Solo made it back to her family on Corellia, Great-Grandpa Gamma had all the droids' memories erased. Great-Grandpa Gamma. He thought it would be easier on her that way. He wanted her to get married again, start a new life. Thraken struggled to take a deep breath, but she never did. "So, what happened to your mom?" "I don't know. She's always been afraid to trust people, and she hates crowds. After my dad died, she just wanted to shut herself away, so she did." Han's knife hand drooped, and he shook his head. "Okay," he said, With a sudden heave, Thraken threw him off, and then before Han could counter the move, their positions were reversed. Han gazed up at his cousin, knowing that he'd be lucky to live through this. Thraken's dark eyes blazed with hate, rage, and sadistic pleasure. "You're going to be very, very sorry, Han," he said quietly. And Han was. Thraken locked him in a bare storeroom for 3 days, giving him only bread and water. On the afternoon of the third day, as Han was sitting listlessly in a corner, Thraken unlocked the door. "I'm afraid this is goodbye, cuz," he said cheerfully. "Someone's here to take you home." Han looked around desperately as Garrus and Lared, Shrike, followed Thraken into the room. But as he already knew, there was nowhere to run. Han shook his head and refused to let himself think about the days that had followed. Shrike had been held back in his punishment only by the fact that he hadn't wanted to damage Han permanently, because of his growing reputation as an expert speeder and swoop pilot. But there had been lots of things he could do that wouldn't cause permanent damage. He had done most of them. The only time Han had been beaten more severely was after the debacle on Jubilar, when he was 17. Han had already been bruised and sore from the gladiator free-for-all he'd been forced to fight in, after being caught cheating at cards. That time Shrike hadn't bothered with a strap, he just used his fist, battering the boy's face and body until Lara and several others had pulled him off Han's unconscious form. And now he's killed Delana, Han thought bitterly. If anyone ever needed killing, it's Garrus Shrike. For a moment, he wondered why it had never occurred to him to kill the unconscious Shrike before he'd made his getaway aboard the Elysian Dream. He'd have been doing the inhabitants of Trader's Luck a favor. Why hadn't he? He'd had the blaster in his hand. Han shook his head. He'd never shot anyone before yesterday, and killing an unconscious man just wasn't his style. But Han knew without being told that if Garrus Shrike ever caught up with him in the future, he was a dead man. The captain never forgot, and he never forgave. He specialized in carrying grudges against anyone who had ever wronged him. Han got up again to check their course, and his air pack. Only a few hours worth of air left now. He did some mental calculations while staring at the display. Close. It's going to be close. I'd better be ready to pop the cargo door on this crate as soon as we land. It's going to be very, very close. And that brings us to Chapter 3, Crash Landing. But I think I'm going to stop it there because my voice is getting a little bit tired here. But we'll pick this back up next Thursday with Chapter 3, Crash Landing. We'll find out how Han fares with getting the ship onto Elysia, and if he runs out of air before that happens. Obviously, he doesn't die. There's 3 more books of this, and we know the rest of the Star Wars story. But we'll have to see if he falls unconscious. Is there any kind of damage or anything like that? Or does he manage to get it all done before he passes out? If you'd like to pick this book up and read it on your own, again, it's called Star Wars: The Paradise Snare by A.C. Crispin. And it looks like this. I got this at a used bookstore for $1.50 several years ago. It went for $6.99 in 1997. I imagine these days at a bookstore you're probably looking at around the same price, probably $7 or $8. Or you can do what I did, go to a used bookstore and find it for a lot cheaper. But it's a fantastic book. Like I said, there's 3 books in this series. It's a trilogy. It is a million times better an origin story than the Solo movie. And I'm really, really still what's the word I'm looking for? Sore, I guess. Annoyed that Disney didn't use much at all of this story in the movie, because it's so much better than the crap they put out. Anyways, also, without giving too many spoilers, in book 2 and 3, might even be a little bit of it in this, there's some references to things that they kind of covered in Rogue One. So this does go from Han as a kid all the way up to basically A New Hope, with the finding the Death Star plans and all that jazz. So it should be pretty good. Like I said, we'll continue this on Thursday, and we'll have some other kind of coffee to talk about. If you joined in after I was talking about the coffee, I had I've got pictures of it in here. I had this right here. It was a mint mocha cappuccino. And I talked a little bit about how to prepare it and everything. If you want to know more information about coffee, about what we had tonight, or about the book that we've been reading, feel free to message me on Twitch. You can also catch me on Twitter. There's that information. And Discord is just cavediscord.com. You can join us there and join the community that we've built here. Very cool, very awesome people. Very safe place. Where everybody can pretty much be themselves without any fear. So yeah, feel free to join us there. Tomorrow we'll be doing FPS Fridays, or First Person Shooter Fridays. We'll be continuing the playthrough of Fallout 4. I've never played any of the Fallout games before yesterday, So I'll be continuing my completely blind playthrough of Fallout 4. Should be pretty fun. Saturdays we normally would have a tabletop stream. Tabletop called Badlands, run on the Fundamental RPG system. But I'm actually going to be doing a event in West Valley, Utah, called Westfest, where I'm going to have a booth set up selling my books, my novella, and my RPG system, Fundamental RPG, as well as the precision mouse pads that you can see below the video, down in the panels below. I'll be selling some of those there. So if you do happen to live in Utah, in the Salt Lake County or Utah County area, feel free to swing by and come say hi. I'll be out there. I will try to get information on where exactly I'm going to be at the event out on Twitter, either tomorrow or on Saturday itself. But yeah, it should be a lot of fun. And yeah, while we're wrapping things up here, let's find somebody to raid. So let's share the love here. Let's see who's online. We've got... oh, we can close that. Let's see. Let's go say hi to Bojangles. So again, thank you guys so much for hanging out. All the contact details are in the chat right now. For Twitter and everything else, I tweet a lot, and I'm very responsive on Twitter, so if you want to chat with me, that's a great place to do it. I'm also on Discord pretty much 24/7. And then again, we'll see you guys back tomorrow at 10 p.m. Mountain Time for more Fallout 4. And next Thursday, we'll continue our book, Star Wars: The Paradise Snare, which is part of the Han Solo trilogy. So, until next time.
How y'all doing tonight? Raven, how you doing? Thanks for the raid. Appreciate you. How was your stream? I know, we really haven't, Pierce. How was Town of Salem? I don't know. I haven't played it yet, but it looks really fun. It was good. Hell yeah. What were you playing? Yeah, I know. We really haven't, Pierce. Yo, Raven, thank you so much for the raid. Appreciate you. Appreciate you. I was doing my audiobook cafe Thursdays. Oh, what is that? Sounds interesting. Sounds interesting.
What? You ignorant slut.
Sorry, I don't know what it is. My bad. Talked about the cappuccino I made and was drinking and read 2 chapters of Star Wars: The Paradise Snare by A.C. Crispin. That sounds fucking awesome. So you made it on stream. That sounds really cool. And that's cool. Oh my god, like some bedtime stories. That sounds awesome, Raven. Oh yeah, well thank you so much for bringing your people over here. Everyone from Raven's... I lost the eye patch, guys. I don't have the fucking eye patch, motherfuckers. Alright. We discuss and talk about a different kind of coffee and do a book reading. That sounds awesome, Raven. That's really, really cool. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that on Twitch. That's cool. Yeah, it's going good. It's going good. We're just, honestly, just kind of bullshitting around, playing some Kingdom Hearts 3 critical mode. Yeah. Mentally preparing for the 24-hour stream tomorrow. But yeah, dude. Thank you so much for the raid. Everyone from Raven's stream, my name is Bojangles. These are the Jigglers. I'm a variety streamer on Twitch, you know how it be. And I don't have a raid call, but I do have this. Something we do every single night at the beginning of the stream. Thank you so much for the raid, Raven. And tonight's meme of the night brought to you in part by Raven. Raven, thank you so much for the raid. Appreciate you. Again, my name is Bojangles, guys. What's up? Hope you like what you see. Tonight's meme of the night comes to us courtesy of motherfucking Jatskin, who is never here when he wins meme of the night. God damn it. Dude, Pierce, yeah. I don't even... dude. Yeah. I was gonna hit you up so I could put you in meme of the month. I was like, nah, not this time. Hey, thank you again, Raven. Appreciate you. Kent, would you mind shouting out Raven for me? Well, you know, either way, you can